Friends, welcome. We're so pleased that you're all able to be here this evening. I'm Father Jim Leese. I'm a priest of the Congregation of Holy Cross, and I serve as the Senior Director for Academic Initiatives and Partnerships here at the London Global Gateway. I'm in my 5th year here. We are thrilled, beyond measure, to welcome the Barrett family and the Barrett Family Lecture to the London Global Gateway. I want to particularly acknowledge Steve and Ruth and their 5 children and an array of their grandchildren, though not all, if you can imagine. We're delighted that you're here and grateful for your kindness. I will leave it to Clement Sedmak, the director for the Nanovic Institute, to introduce our main speaker, but I do want to acknowledge the presence of Lord Daniel Brennan, the wife of Lord Patten and a cousin of his wife, Lady Lavender Patten. And also Guillaume Lacroix, the first counselor at the Embassy of France. We're delighted that you're here. I also want to acknowledge the presence of Michael Addo, the director of our law program, and Josh Copeland, who's the executive director of our London Global Gateway. It is during some somber days that we gather, and no one can keep from their mind very long the situation in Ukraine, and so we think of Ukraine and Eastern Europe and the entire world, and determined not to ignore the misery which so many are suffering at this time. And as a Catholic university, we thought it fitting to offer a brief prayer as we begin this evening. We are not all of the same faith tradition, even the same denominations, and some of us are of none. But in a moment like this, we offer what we have in hopes of bringing healing and hope to a situation that is rather dark and rather dire. And it is in the tradition of the University of Notre Dame, a Catholic university, that I offer this prayer before we begin. Lord of all people and all nations, we lift before you the people of Ukraine, each girl and boy, each woman and man living in fear of what tomorrow might bring. We long for a time you spoke of through your prophet Isaiah, when weapons of war would be beaten into plowshares, when nation will no longer lift up sword against another nation. We cry out to you for peace. Protect those who only desire and deserve to live in security and safety. Comfort those who fear for their lives and the lives of their loved ones. Change the hearts of those who set on violence and aggression. Fill earthly leaders with the wisdom to find paths to peace. May your will be done here on earth as it is in heaven. May your peace reign now and always. We lift this prayer to you, our God, who is able to do more than we can ever ask or imagine. In the name of Christ our Savior, please bring us peace. Amen. Amen. And now I turn it over to Clement Sedmak to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Father Jim. Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for hosting us. Thank you for being here. My name is Clement Sedmak, and I serve as director of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. It's wonderful to be here. This is a true Nanovic Institute moment. The Nanovic Institute has been established 30 years ago to build bridges between Europe and Notre Dame. We try to bring Europe to the University of Notre Dame, and we try to bring the University of Notre Dame to Europe. Today, Steve and Ruth Barrett brought us together. The Barrett Family Lecture Series was established through the generous support of Steve and Ruth. The initiative brings prominent leaders in the areas of business, politics, and the arts to the University of Notre Dame's Global Gateway facilities, either in Dublin or in London, to share their views on issues of major importance to the understanding of contemporary Europe with Notre Dame students and the wider community. Welcome all. May I please take a moment to introduce Steve Barrett. Steve is president of Barrett Advisory, a strategic and operational consulting firm. He's also on the business school adjunct faculty at Boston College and is a trustee of the Catholic Foundation. Previously, Steve was executive vice president and chief financial officer of Whirlpool Corporation and chief financial officer of Global Fabric and Home Care at the Procter & Gamble Company, where he spent most of his career before retiring in 2002. Steve and his wife Ruth, as Father Jim has mentioned so accurately, have 5 children. They live in Boston and Maine, and they also have a home in Florida. Steve is an important member of the Nunavik Advisory Board and has chaired this board for 12 years, I believe. 12 years. His advice on financial matters and questions has been and is invaluable, and we are so very grateful that Steve is generously giving his time and his expertise to our institute. Steve's and Ruth's generosity have also made today's lecture possible. Thank you so very much. The Nunavik Institute has launched a new strategic plan last fall, an event that did not go unnoticed for all of you, I guess. And one of the big key pillars of this plan is the facilitation of discussions about big questions. Today's lecture will explore such a big question. Is there a new world order? The question has become more pressing after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Is there a way to go back to the pre-invasion world? What is the role of China in this new world order? Since the Second World War, the international rule book has to a great extent been written by the United States and the world's liberal democracies. But how is this affected by the economic rise of China and its non-democratic rule? Will there be a new world order? And it is a very important person who will explore this big question with us. Chris Patten, Lord Patten of Barnes, will deliver the 2022 Barrett Family Lecture. Lord Patten has been the Chancellor of the University of Oxford since 2003. Born and raised in London, he graduated from Balliol College, Oxford in 1965, before embarking on a long and impressive career in politics, diplomacy, and foreign service. Lord Patten was first elected Member of Parliament for Bath in 1979 as a member of the Conservative Party. He was appointed Secretary of State for the Environment by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in 1989 and became chairperson of the Conservative Party in 1990. Between 1992 and 1997, he served as the last British governor of Hong Kong, overseeing its transfer to China. Since then, he led the Independent Commission on Policing for Northern Ireland, was European Commissioner for External Relations, and was chairman of the BBC Trust. He's the author of numerous books, including Cousins and Strangers, America, Britain and Europe in a New Century, and East and West, the last governor of Hong Kong on power, freedom and the future. Many things can change in 25 years. Things were very different in Hong Kong when Lord Patten left Hong Kong as last British governor. Many things can change in 25 days when we think of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Lord Patten will help us understand where we are and where we are going as a global community. Lord Patten will speak for 45 minutes, and then we have about 15 minutes for polite, brief and brilliant Q&A. Dear Lord Patten, we are very grateful that you're here with us tonight. It's a big honor. Thank you so much. May I please ask you to deliver the 2022 Barrett Family Lecture. Thank you so much.
Father, Director, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'd like to thank the Nunavik Institute for this invitation, and I'd like above all to thank the Barrett family for being responsible for this lecture or lecture series. I'd particularly like to welcome those of your grandchildren, 3 of whom haven't been here before, 1 of whom hasn't been here for some extraordinary reason since he was 1. But I hope you all enjoy your visit and come back a great deal, and after you've finished at Notre Dame, or as the French would say for some curious reason, Notre Dame. I hope that when you've got your spectacular degrees at Notre Dame, you come to Oxford and do a second degree there. So thank you very much indeed for the invitation, and again many thanks to the Barrett family, not least for having 1 more grandchild than my wife and I have. As you can imagine, when I first thought about the subject of this lecture, the world looked rather different. Mr. Putin has changed things quite a bit. And it made me think about my good fortune and the good fortune of others of my age in being born when we were. I was born in 1944. The day I was born, the German army was driven out of Crimea by the Red Army. I had a great friend at school, my best friend at school, who was a Polish boy. And the week after I was born, later in May, his own father was killed before George was born in the Battle of Monte Cassino in Italy. 3 months after that, my wife's father, who was a great Cambridge Olympic athlete, was killed in Normandy, in a little village which we visited a few years ago, which looks the most perfect pastoral scene, killed by what is sometimes called friendly fire during the Battle of the Falaise Gap, about a month before my wife was born. So from there to today, the end of the Second World War, the end of what a lot of people have referred to as the Second 30 Years War in Europe, 1914-18 to 1939-45. 40 million people killed in the First World War, 80 million killed in the Second World War, with half of those 80 million from Russia and China. There's a wonderful English poet who's not read today as much as he should be, who wrote some wonderful poetry in the 30s, 40s, and even 50s, who got things absolutely right about the 1930s and the 1940s. In the nightmares of the dark, all the dogs of Europe bark. All the living nations wait, each sequestered in its hate. He wrote the epitaph to a tyrant, in which he wrote that when he laughs, all the senators burst with laughter with him. When he cries, the little children die in the streets. Which is, I guess, pretty much what's happening in Mariupol at the moment. So I've been lucky, like those who were born in Europe after the Vienna convention, which ushered in a century of more or less peace, just as we experienced after 1939-45, with again Auden paying a tribute to diplomats. On the issue of their charm depended a land laid waste and all its young men slain, its women weeping, and its towns in terror. So we put that behind us. And not least thanks to American leadership, we created a new and rather better world. Not getting everything right. Think of Vietnam, think of the Middle East. But by and large, with generous American leadership, helped by Europe, putting in place a world order of rules and institutions which ensured for most people decades of peace and decades of increasing prosperity. It's one of the few examples you can think of in history of a victorious country applying afterwards rules which it has partly made itself, but shared with the rulemaking with others, which apply to the victor as well as to others. We saw the creation of the UN. We saw the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank, IMF, the GATT, which became the WTO, the UN itself, imperfect, but an admirable institutional aspiration. We saw all that, and in Europe, we saw NATO and the European Union. Europeans often like to think that NATO was America's idea and imposed on Europe, and the European Union was our idea, or not at the time, Britain's. Actually, it's almost the reverse of the truth. After the 1418 war, Europe found that America had gone home and left us with the League of Nations and, alas, the opportunity of fighting one another again. And we wanted to try to stop that happening after 1945. And we pressed the Americans to the establishment of what became NATO. The Americans were only prepared to do it if we would put behind the sort of nationalist arguments which had produced the 1914-18 war. So NATO was created, in the words of the first Secretary General, Lord Ismay, to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. And the European Union was created, first of all, with the coal and steel community, which sought to bind European countries together, first of all through economic ties, which would prevent the sort of nationalist, populist wars which had caused so much appalling damage in Europe, and which had brought young American men and young American women to Europe to risk their lives and leave their lives in order to deal with a European civil war. And internationally, the peace that had been established and the growing trade with much smaller barriers to trade between countries helped also to ensure that countries in Asia as well escaped from the 1940s. With the so-called tiger economies in Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, taking advantage of the globalization of markets, and eventually China joining that process as well. But for the first years after the Second World War, there were two holdouts from what was happening elsewhere. The first was the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, Russia's empire in Eastern Europe. And in the 1970s and 80s, that empire became unsustainable for Russia, for reasons which were economic, demographic, and because Russia, why didn't we learn, got involved in a war in Afghanistan. And when the Russian Empire in Europe went, it went very quickly. The frost always goes rapidly in the morning when the sun comes out. A friend of mine who was the Minister for Europe in one of Margaret Thatcher's governments, never a very easy thing to be, was visiting Berlin in 1989 on regular ministerial visit. And the day he arrived in West Berlin, a kid, a student, was shot, not climbing over the wall from East Berlin, but trying to swim the canal from the east to the west. And my friend said to his officials, "I really must make a protest about this. This is disgraceful." to have done it at all, and to have done it when a Western minister's here. And his friends, his diplomatic colleagues, his staff, and the West German staff said, wouldn't do that if I were you, Minister, not very sensible. You know, we've got a very good relationship with the East Berlin authorities and East Germany. We can do things in a quieter and more sensible way. As William said, within 3 weeks, there was no wall, no East Berlin, no East Germany. All swept away into the ash can of history, as usually happens with tyrannies, which look as though they're there forever until they're not. And China changed in the 70s and 80s as well. China, under Mao, had seen, according to probably the best historian of these matters, a Dutchman called Frank de Cotter, had seen about 45 million people died in the Great Leap Forward, the Great Famine, the Cultural Revolution, under Mao. Most of the population, or at least 2/3 of the population in Hong Kong, are themselves families of, or from families of people who fled communism in mainland China. That was Mao, in a society which has now, of course, as people point out, risen like a rocket. They're the two most significant points I used to think in my political life had been the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union and in Russia, and the rise, or rather the rejuvenation of China. Why do I say that? Because until 1820, China represented 30% of the world's GDP. By 1970, that had fallen to 3%, partly because of the behavior of the imperial powers during the declining decades of the Qing dynasty, partly because of the Chinese fighting between themselves, first of all the warlords, then the Chiang Kai-shek and Mao, and then the policies pursued by Mao Zedong. But once Mao had gone, we must hope to his maker. I once asked Jung Chan, who'd written a great biography of him, how he rated in the league table of murderous tyrants. I said, how many points would you give him out of 10 in comparison with Stalin and Hitler? And she said, about 10.5. And once China had rejoined the world economy, it did rise spectacularly rapidly. Grew from 1980 to, or 1979 to be strictly accurate, to 2018 by, on average, 9.5% a year. It was doubling its economy every 8 years as it, to repeat myself, joined the global economy. So you have on the one hand the collapse of the Soviet Union, and on the other hand, under an authoritarian regime which became slightly more relaxed as the years went on, more of which in a moment, you had the reverse happening. Russia is a clapped-out economy with appalling demographic problems, with a very high death rate among men, not least because of alcoholism, with a very low fertility rate, probably one of the lowest in the world. So the Russian population has been declining year after year, which is one of President Putin's obsessions. Russia is, in terms of its size, despite its population, the Russian economy is about half the size of the French economy, about half the size of the British economy. In terms of economic prosperity per head, Britain is 4 times as well off, France 4 times as well off, Germany 5 times as well off, because their economy is 3 times the size of Russia's. But Russia has nuclear weapons, and it has oil and gas, and it has attitude. I often used to say when I made a speech and didn't say anything about Russia, I'd say to them, hands up everybody in the room who's got anything in their house which was made in Russia. Vodka, a sometimes unread copy of War and Peace, and maybe, particularly if you're German, some gas or petrol in the tanks. But otherwise, nothing. So, there's Russia, a very weak economy, coming out of the communist era, first of all with President Yeltsin, and increasingly a gang of thieving businessmen and the KGB. There's a very, very good book by somebody called Catherine Belton, and she's been pursued through the courts for what she says in it about the Russian oligarchs who've made their homes in London, and for what she says about Putin. And doubtless 1 or 2 British lawyers have, to their shame, made a lot of money out of defending, for example, Mr. Abramovich's reputation. Mr. Abramovich is a fraudster, a crook, owned one of our most popular football teams. And Catherine Belton, in his wonderful book called Putin's People, chronicles the way that the KGB took over Russia, particularly after the death of Mr. Yeltsin. And the inheritor of all was a former KGB officer, Mr. Putin. And as people say, you can take the man out of the KGB, but you can't take the KGB out of the man. I first met him when there was an European Union Russia summit meeting in 1999 in Finland. The Finns were in the presidency of the European Union. And at the last moment we were told that Mr. Yeltsin wasn't able to come because he was ill, hungover. There's a very funny story by John Major about a meeting with Mr. Yeltsin, a British EU meeting in Downing Street. And Yeltsin comes in a bit late, grey with a hangover, sitting at the cabinet table opposite John Major. And John Major, making polite, bantering conversation, says to him, "So, Mr. Yeltsin, what's the present state of the Russian economy?" And Mr. Yeltsin looks up and says, "Good." So John Major says, "Would you like to say any more about it than that?" So Yeltsin says, "Not good." So at the last moment for this Finland meeting in 1999, Mr. Yeltsin says he can't come, and he sends the then acting Prime Minister, who was this young guy, Putin, who was a member of the KGB, had been appointed at one stage as their man in Dresden, had been responsible for providing the financial link between the KGB and the Stasi and the Baader-Meinhof gang, who went around Germany murdering politicians and businessmen. So Putin's arrived a bit late, and we say to him, we've been reading the tapes. Those were the days. Do you remember tapes? We were reading the tapes, and they reported explosions in Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, with a lot of people killed. And we say to Putin, as we're waiting for the meeting to start, can you tell us what's been happening in Grozny? And he said, what do you mean? So we said, well, there's been explosions. So we said, oh, I hadn't heard about that. He said, I'll find out for you, and we'll talk about it at lunch. So at lunch, somebody said to him, can you tell us about those explosions now in Grozny? And he said, oh, he said, yes, I've asked about it, and apparently the Chechen guerrillas were running a couple of arms bazaars in Grozny, and some of the weapons exploded, and it was what you people call an own goal, I think. Well, by that stage, the same tapes, were reporting that Grozny had been attacked by Russian helicopter gunships. So not only was Mr. Putin lying to us, but we knew he was lying to us. A pathological liar. And I'm afraid, as we know, as we can see today, that is still true. So gradually, the KGB and their friends, the Siloviki, and these fraudsters and spivs who raped the economy for their own interest, particularly the minerals and the energy, they took over, and Russia went on supplying us with oil and gas. And we went on kidding ourselves that sooner or later it'd be all right, and they'd become more like us. And after Grozny was flattened in a war against the Chechen guerrillas, after there'd been all sorts of mysterious explosions in blocks of flats in Moscow, which were blamed on the Chechen guerrillas, but a lot of people thought were the work of the KGB. After Estonia had been attacked with cybersecurity measures in 2007, and we went on hoping that Mr. Putin would behave properly. After 2008, the Olympic year, when Georgia was invaded by Russian troops, and two parts of Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, were torn out. After the Crimea was taken over in 2014, after the Donbass in Ukraine became a war between Russian proxies, or straightforward Russians, and Ukrainian forces. 14,000 Ukrainians killed in the Donbass. The Malaysian Airlines plane, remember, shot down by Russian missiles with about 300 innocent people killed, and Mr. Putin said it wasn't him, Governor. After all that, we still thought we could do business with him, and we needed the oil and the gas, and we thought that, after all, sooner or later they'll become more like us. And we thought it would be slightly tiresome if we had to give up parts of the peace dividend. Remember the peace dividend? And spend more on defending ourselves. So now we've got Ukraine. How does it end? How do we imagine we'd be able to deal with Mr. Putin, however it ends? I'll come back to Russia at the end of my remarks. But at the moment, even if you're not totally optimistic about the Ukraine, you see Mr. Putin's strategy wrecking the Russian economy, insofar as there's very much to wreck, turning the ruble into a junk currency, seeing half the forex reserves of Russia confiscated, seeing the Russian army humiliated in the eyes of the world, seeing NATO reinvigorated, Germany standing up against Russia, thousands of young Russian kids going home in body bags, thousands more Russians, people with qualifications usually, trying to get out of Russia to Georgia and elsewhere. There's success for you. What about China, which is at present trying to avoid being seen to be an accomplice of President Putin? I was talking to students about this earlier, without at the same time denouncing him and finding it's a very, very tight road to try to follow. Well, in China, we've seen the most extraordinary economic progress, as I said earlier. China now the biggest manufacturer of goods in the world. China the biggest importer of energy in the world, thanks to China taking huge and properly huge advantage of the opening of markets in the rest of the world, of the GATT and so on. People often say, we need China. I tell you this, China needs us. In a period of 15 years between the early 90s and the early 2000s, China increased its exports to the United States by 1,600% in 15 years. In this country, we've seen our exports to China over a 40-year period rise by just over 3% in real terms every year. Hey, guess what? China's exports to us have increased by 9% in real terms a year. So of course it's an important source of economic growth in the world, but don't kid me that China's doing us a tremendous favor. China talks about these economic relationships as providing a win-win situation. They used to talk to me when I was negotiating with them, both in Europe and when I was in Hong Kong. This is a win-win situation. What they actually meant was we win, and then we win again. That's what win-win means when translated from whatever dialogue the Chinese are talking at the time. So China grew with the rest of the world. It did incredibly well. I try to always to distinguish between the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party. I see China, of course, a great deal through the prism of Hong Kong. And it's perfectly true that in the first few years after 1997, China kept to the agreement that it had reached, which had been put into an international treaty lodged at the UN, that Hong Kong could go on with its own way of life for 50 years after 1997. It was called One Country, Two Systems, which is gradually being turned by the Chinese Communist Party into One Country, Two Systems. So, for a time after 1997, that seemed to work. Not everything went perfectly. The Chinese interfered too much in Hong Kong. They went back on the promises they'd made on the development of accountable government, democracy in other words. But by and large, Hong Kong was still the same place it had been when I had the privilege of being its governor. It was still a great international trading city. That was true under Jiang Zemin, true under Hu Jintao. And then in 2012, 2013, Xi Jinping became the president for life, as will be apparent at the National People's Congress later this year, or the Party Congress, when he's almost certainly going to get a life term. Now, Deng Xiaoping had made changes after Mao. He'd done away with the idea of one leader. He'd done away with the reverence which everybody had to show for a political leader. He'd done away with one leader and had developed the notion of a more consensual sort of government. He tried to get the party out of some of the things which it had got into. All that reversed under Xi Jinping. Personality cult back. He reveres Mao. This Chinese Communist Party has sought to impose its authority in every part of society. Geographically true, from Xinjiang to Tibet to Hong Kong. It's true about civil society. It's true about any dissident activity. It's true about the law. It's true across the board. Why? First of all, because the Chinese leadership was spooked by an attempt by one Chinese leader called Bo Xilai, whose wife, if you remember, was eventually accused and tried for having murdered a British businessman with whom she had a partnership. Bo Xilai had tried to elbow his way into the Chinese leadership, and that had got people very nervous. He was a sort of Maoist populist. And there were three other things which I think it made them very worried in the Chinese Communist Party. The first is they were worried by the impact of globalization on their ability to hold on to public opinion. Secondly, they were very worried about urbanization, bringing into the cities millions more people from the countryside who weren't as easy to control. And thirdly, they got quite worried about the way the surveillance state was undermined by the internet and by technology. And for all those reasons, I think Xi Jinping was given the support. Though it's curious because his father was a reformer who was brought back from incarceration by Deng Xiaoping. Xi Jinping was given the support to tighten communist grip on everything. Now, some people say, you're being frightfully unfair. What you seem to be suggesting is a new Cold War. But actually, it's the Chinese, and particularly Xi Jinping, who when you read, and remember we didn't do this sufficiently with Putin, when you read what they've set out as their objectives, sounds as though he wants a new Cold War. The first document, which was sent round as instructions to party cadres and to people in government after he'd become boss, was called rather prosaically Communique Number 9. And it tells the party and government officials that they have to recognize that they have to be involved in an intense struggle, quote unquote, against every aspect of Westernism, of liberal democracy, of open societies. Freedom of speech, civil society, parliamentary democracy. All those things which we take for granted, but which are seen as real threats in the Zhongnanhai, where the Chinese leadership hangs out. And one reason I think why they've been so tough on Hong Kong is that Hong Kong represents all those things as a Chinese city. They're all aspects of what it's been like to live in China. Where are you allowed to remember the massacre in Tiananmen Square in Hong Kong, where there is a vigil on the 4th of June every year, where people on university campuses have put up sculptures to remember Tiananmen and the people who were murdered there, where Cardinal Zen would tell you about it, even if you didn't want to hear. That's called, by the Chinese, historical recidivism. I don't often use the word myself. What it means is the Chinese don't want any version of history to be looked at, to be studied, to be known about, except the version which they approve. So where did we go wrong and what should we do? Well, first of all, one of my main critics when I was governor of Hong Kong was a diplomat who once said and wrote about the Chinese leadership, they might, he said, be thuggish dictators, but they're men of their word. Well, at least part of that is true. One international agreement after another which they've broken. I won't get involved in the debate about the origins of the coronavirus. But what is true is when SARS hit the world in 2002, 2003, starting in China, denied by the Chinese authorities, who, when the WHO were allowed to send a team to Beijing, put everybody who was in hospital as a result of SARS into hotels so there wouldn't be anybody for the WHO to see. When that happened, the WHO got an agreement on what were called the International Health Regulations, which eventually the Chinese signed in 2005 or 2006. And Article 6 obliges all the signatories to make public within 24 hours in a timely fashion any news about the outbreak of another epidemic disease. The end of January 2020, Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, is in Australia. There are other examples of what I'm going to say. And the Taiwanese have already spotted what's happening in southern China, in Wuhan and elsewhere. And have probably picked it up from some of those heroic Chinese doctors and nurses who tried to blow the whistle on it all and were threatened by the police as a result. So when Wang Yi is asked by the Australian foreign minister what they need to know about this epidemic, he says, oh, it's just a small thing. It's curable and preventable and isn't transmissible. The following weeks, the Australians discover that their health industry is doing fantastically well, selling things, PPE equipment, where to? China. And they were buying stuff from us as well. So the Australians then try to get it raised in the WHO, at which point the Chinese, who like to control the narrative, start bullying the Australians, and we all go tut-tut. But meantime, Australian wine piles up on docks. No more ore bought for a bit, and the Australians are put in the doghouse. Think of the agreement that President Xi made with President Obama about the non-militarization of the atolls and islands in the South China Sea. Breached. Think of the agreement with Britain. Breached. President Obama, no bloodthirsty militarist, said that as far as the WTO was concerned, the Chinese had bent or broken the rules at every turn, and it's true. They kept the rules, they keep the rules if they are helpful for China, and shout at everybody else about it. So, unfortunately, they don't keep the rules themselves. Win-win. So the first thing is, it's very difficult to trust them to keep international agreements. And what my view is that we should make sure that they're called out when they breach international agreements, and that they're made to pay a price when they do so. I'm very much in favour of them being part of international organisations, but not if they break their word in them whenever it suits them. Secondly, just as we were delusional about Russia, so we're delusional about China. And it's partly that hubris which I mentioned in relation to 1989. Francis Fukuyama's great book, The End of History, well, by which, to be fair to him, he didn't mean the end of interesting times, but did mean the triumph for economic and political liberalism. So we kidded ourselves that sooner or later, as Marx wrote, economic and technical change would produce political change. After the Chinese had joined the WTO, our then Prime Minister, Sir Anthony Blair, said that now China was going to find we would find that China would make unstoppable progress to democracy. Didn't quite work out like that, did it? But a lot of people assumed that what would happen was what they would like to happen. So, break their word and not very reliable as stakeholders in global institutions. It's delusional to think that political change will simply come to China as a result of us doing business with them. Thirdly, we don't unfortunately stand up to them when they break their word about trade issues. We still behave as though the only way you can do trade with China is by kowtowing to them. That's not true. We should do trade with China just as we do trade with anybody else. We don't feel obliged to accept, I don't know, Norway's view of the world in order to buy salmon from them or sell them whatever we sell to Norway. And it's crazy to think you can only do business with China if you accept their narrative. And as well as all that, and working together with our friends to stand up to them when they bully us, I think we also have to recognize something which George Kennan, who wrote that famous long telegram about Russia in 1946, and said in it, what we have to understand is that their view of reality and ours are incompatible. Incompatible. So our view and China's, our view of trade in body parts and theirs is incompatible. Our view and theirs on forced sterilizations and abortions in Xinjiang are incompatible. Our view and theirs of the wickedness, so they would say, of a free press, telling you what the government is doing. Our views on that are incompatible. Our views and theirs on the treatment of Tibet are incompatible. Our views and theirs on Taiwan are incompatible, not least because the last time a Chinese emperor was asked about it, in the 18th century, he denied that Taiwan was any part of China. So, some people think all this makes me a Cold War warrior. But all I'm asking for is a bit of realism and international cooperation by liberal democracies, either in dealing with Russia or in dealing with China. Now, there is a view that this will mean that there are two blocks in the world. Well, if that were to be the outcome, I'd prefer to be in a bloc which is liberally democratic than one which is totalitarian or at best autocratic. But I don't actually think that it's quite like that. The Chinese in particular, and Russia, think that the West is in decline. President Putin thinks that a mark of us being in decline is the way we treat women. Fancying having a Secretary of State who's a woman like Madeleine Albright. The fact that we have a pretty liberal view of sexual preferences. How can you do that? I once heard him refer to his then Georgian Foreign Minister Ivanov, who was actually quite a decent man, as my little Georgian, with a sneer. So, we have to, I think, stand up to them while refusing to accept their view in Russia or in China that the West is in irrevocable decline. I don't think it is. Apart from Chinese propagandists, the only people who talk about American decline are Americans. And the bad news for you guys is it's not true, unless you want it to be true. And who's saying that President Putin has a glorious future in front of him? I think at best we're in post-Putin peak. And we're certainly in post-China peak. China faces 3 or 4 huge problems. Demographic, with the number of those aged over 65 trebling to 300 million by 2030, with an extraordinary imbalance between male and female. And it's an imbalance which increases as you go down the age. So by the time you get to people between the age of, as it were, 5 and 20, the imbalance between boys and girls is somewhere between 15 and 20%. Imagine it. What does that tell you about the future? We know why it's happening. What does it tell you about the future? Environment. We've all got problems, environmental problems. But the water problems, for example, in China are appalling, with most of the water wanted in the north and most of the water falling or being there in the south. And economic. The Evergrande collapse a few months ago was an indication of the soundness of the Russian economy. Unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, unsustainable. Not my words, the 4 uns. The description of the Chinese economy by the last Chinese Prime Minister, Wen Jiabao. An economy in which indebtedness represents 300% of GDP. An economy which, despite the brilliant inventiveness of many Chinese, the government is loading as much as it can of borrowing to the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, and trying to screw down the private sector, which is responsible for the majority of the growth, but represents, because it's private, like those big tech companies, represents a threat to the Communist Party and to their ability to rule. So my own view is that we've got problems in the West, but they've got much bigger problems, hence post-peak China, in China. And we should stop being so nervous about how we deal with them. We should be courteous. We should distinguish between the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party, but we should be very firm about what we believe in. And that's where I do have one cautionary note. We have to go on practicing the liberal democracy, the open society values, which we claim, and I believe rightly, will always ultimately triumph over any authoritarian or totalitarian state. And I hope very much that that's the view in our European countries. I hope it's the view in Australia and New Zealand and Canada. And I hope that it's the view in the United States. But sometimes, if I'm honest, I get worried about the Republican Party in the United States. When I first got involved in politics in New York in 1965, I was supposed to be going off to join the BBC. I was waylaid, working for a Republican candidate for mayor of New York. He subsequently became an independent and a Democrat, so he wasn't a hardline Republican. But at the time, the American senators in New York were Javits and Keating. They couldn't get near winning a primary for the Republican Party today. They were both moderate, centrists, internationalists. I don't think they would have denied that President Biden won the election. I think they would take a poor view of trying to stop some people voting on some rather spurious grounds about fraud. I think they would understand that in order to make sure that liberal values, that the values of a democracy continue to win the argument around the world, you have to make sure that people can't point at you and say, but you're not practicing them at home. So I think that as somebody who manages to be both an Americophile and a Francophile, who owes the fact that I'm in politics at all to the United States, who thinks that I owe the fact that I've lived in decades of peace and prosperity, is largely because of the United States. Somebody who wants my kids and my grandchildren to have the same prospects and advantages and to live with the same sort of decency and with the same sort of standards. International cooperation, standing up with confidence for what we believe in, dealing with people on a basis of values and not being driven by greed, or particularly when the greed is not matched by any evidence. All those things, and how do you do it? At the end of Henry Kissinger's book on diplomacy, it's a great book. It's largely about the Congress of Vienna and the consequences of 19th century Europe. At the end of that book, he quotes a Spanish proverb, which is contained in a poem which I used to know. I taught myself it in Spanish, and I can't do it anymore. I realized as I was approaching this last sentence, by somebody called Machado. And the proverb says, traveller, don't ask where the road is. Roads are made by walking them. So we just have to do it ourselves. And that means everybody in a democracy, because we're all responsible. And you people who are a lot younger than somebody born in 1944, have got, of course, a particular responsibility to find the road and make the road, and do it probably better than my generation did. And that's the way we'll get a better world order. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lord Patten. Do we have a microphone, or can we just have our questions like this? There's a mic. Yes.
It's for karaoke.
So we have 10 to 11 minutes and a half for polite and brilliant questions.
It's very precise, that.
It's an amazing opportunity to ask a question to Lord Patten.
Who can then dodge it?
Professor Müller.
Thank you very much.
Mic is coming your way.
Oh, thank you very much, Lord Patten. That was very, very insightful, and I'm really, really grateful that you are standing up in this clear way for liberal democracies and for their values, because we tend to doubt them on our own end. Yet, let me ask you, I mean, I'm not very good at political things at all, so at which point does it become dangerous to stand up to a bully? I mean, I think that we are all a little bit afraid to stand up to these two specific bullies that are without any doubt bullies, because they have nuclear weapons. At which point are we right to be careful, or a little bit, even if we are wrong at the same time? Thank you.
Well, it's a very good question. First thing is, you don't go out of your way to get clobbered by a bully if the bully is bigger than you are. But if you don't stand up to a bully, sooner or later you get bullied a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth time. So the real challenge for us with Putin at the moment in Ukraine is, while we clearly don't want to provoke the sort of behavior which might encourage Putin to use tactical nuclear weapons or gas, if we're not careful, it'll be Poland or Estonia or Lithuania or Latvia which is in the firing line. I was reading an article an essay with which I hugely disagreed, by somebody called John Mearsheimer, who's a distinguished commentator on international affairs in Chicago, saying it was all our fault, what's happened in Ukraine, because we'd allowed countries in East and Central Europe to join NATO, or encouraged them. President Bush had done it. 2008, the Budapest Conference. And I thought, one of my less polite thoughts was, it's easier to think that if you live in Chicago than if you live in Tallinn. It's easier to think that if you don't live in Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. Easier to think that then. So I think, yes, you have to stand up to bullies, but the trouble with the so-called mutually assured destruction idea of deterrence is, if there's one rogue politician, leader, who looks as though he might breach what's been thought to be the convention on these matters over the years, then you can find yourself giving too much ground to bullying, and I think it's very difficult. You'll notice that everybody is now very reluctant to use the word red lines in relation to Russia, because that's what was used in relation to Syria before it was destroyed and before chemical weapons were used by Russians and Syrians. And the British Parliament didn't distinguish itself, and nor did the Obama administration. We said there were red lines, and then when they were crossed and people were murdered as a result, we did nothing about it. So we're obviously careful about using the expression now, and even more careful about what we would say, what we would do if the Russians did use chemical or biological weapons. We've already, I think, turned a blind eye to their use of thermobaric weapons. I think we've probably turned a blind eye to their use of cluster bombs. So I think it's a very, very, very difficult issue, and I don't want to provoke a nuclear war with President Putin, but I do want him to stop murdering Ukrainians. And in different senses, I'd say similar things, though it's not quite the same, about dealing with China. But what we have to do, above all, is stick together, is make sure there is a price for bad behaviour. And I think at the moment, at least in economic terms, we're doing that with Russia, with the trashing of the Russian economy.
Thank you. Another question? Given the erudite answers from Lord Patten, I can give you one last question.
Give us the mic.
Give a mic to me.
Lord Patten, I actually want to join my colleagues in saying thank you for such an enlightening kind of leadership in what we should do. One of the key bits of the notes that I took from you was to stand by our values, which actually kind of resonates with the beginning of your lecture about the US leadership post-war, with a commitment to values. One of the values that we espoused so much was the rule of law, leadership by law, so trade, use of force, human rights. Pretty much everything we did has to be by law. From what we're hearing from, in the light of activities in China and Russia, do you think there's a future for the rule of law?
The very first, when I went to, we start again. When I went to Beijing, after I'd introduced in the Legislative Council my proposals for changes in Hong Kong to protect the Bill of Rights and to try to ensure that the electoral system was at least clean and as democratic as possible without being as democratic as I might have liked it to have been. And I went up to see my opposite number in Beijing for what had previously been the sort of ritual humiliation and kowtow, head banging against the floor. And we were talking, I was talking about the rule of law. And I said to him how that was fundamental for us. And he said, well, we believe in the rule of law as well. We believe in law. So I said, you believe in rule by law. That's different to the rule of law. He said, what do you mean? So I said, well, I was until recently a British minister. I was responsible, among other things, for the environment. And I would get regularly challenged in the courts by citizens' groups or businesses who thought I was doing the wrong thing. And I would never know clearly whether I was going to win or not. The lawyer in my department, the Department of the Environment, was called Mr. Maybe. And I said, that's the most wonderfully suitable name, I told him one day, because when I ask you whether this is a watertight case, you'd say, well, maybe. So I tried to explain to my opposite number, Lu Ping, the difference between the rule of law and rule by law, and he thought I was kidding him. It was a completely foreign idea. The idea that there's a division between the judiciary, the executive, and the legislature. So I think the rule of law will always be followed by more people if they get a chance, because it's fairer to people. But rule by law is what governments and authoritarian states would always prefer. And occasionally our own government here has given the impression that it likes rule by law rather than rule of law. But no way. When it tried to prorogue Parliament in order to make it easier to get the Brexit legislation through, the courts, thank heavens, and a wonderful woman who was then the head of our Supreme Court called them out and stopped them doing it. And that's what in any society you want to see happen. I've got just one last thought. Democracy isn't just about people voting. Two of my favourite writers about political society are Cicero and de Tocqueville. And both of them are hugely eloquent about the importance of checks and balances. Because all sorts of things can be done which are bad if you just think that that one vote, one set of ballot boxes can decide things forever. You do need checks and balances, and that's what the rule of law should provide. So I think for me it's probably the most important thing in any society. In last point, in that wonderful play about Thomas More by, what was the writer called?
Robert.
Sorry?
Robert.
Absolutely. More says to one of Henry VIII's advisors, who's saying to him he's got to obey the king's law. More says to him something like, the laws of the country are like the trees of England. If you cut them all down, what protects you when the wind blows? And it's true. So, Thomas More, who's had a bad time recently from Hilary Mantel and others, actually got it right, I think.
Thanks very much. Please allow me to bring this evening to a close with 2 points. One is gratitude, and one is a little gift. This was our 2022 Barrett Family Lecture, the first time in London. If the weather is as nice as it is today, we come again. I want to thank Father Jim Lees and his team for the hospitality here at the London Global Gateway. Special thanks to Joanna Byrne and Tom Finch, who were so helpful for us. Of course, a big thank you to our Nanovic Institute team who have made this possible. A big thank you to Steve and Ruth Barrett for making this whole event possible. And obviously, a big word of thank you to Lord Patten. Maybe a round of applause for Lord Patten.